Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take the sources you've shared with us, dive deep into them, and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, all custom tailored just for you.
And our mission today, to help you get really well informed on a figure who is still, well, absolutely fascinating and, yes, deeply controversial. Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, definitely controversial. The main source we're digging into today are excerpts from The Eye in the Triangle by Israel Regardie. Now, this isn't just, any book about Crowley. It comes with a pretty remarkable thumbs up from Alan Watts.
That's right. Watts actually called it the best book on mysticism that I've read in 10 years or more. And you got to think about Alan Watts' reputation. He wasn't someone who praised things lightly, especially in a field he often felt was swimming in what he called tapioca-like fog.
Or bovine excreta, I think was the other phrase.
Exactly. So his recommendation tells you, okay, this book is probably offering something substantial, some real clarity.
Right. So our goal is to use this text as our main guide to unpack Crowley's complexities, his life, his work, his influences. And yeah, there's often contradictory parts of his personality and his whole philosophy.
So get ready. We're going to be exploring mysticism, magic, psychology, and frankly, a life lived very much on the edge, all through the lens of this specific and highly regarded source.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Why Crowley? And why is this book, The Eye in the Triangle, such a valuable way to look at him? Well, it starts with that Alan Watts connection you mentioned. For Watts to single this book out from a field he often found pretty murky. Well, that gives Regardie's perspective some immediate weight, doesn't it?
It really does. And right from the start, the book hits you with this powerful paradox about Crowley. He's described as incredibly complicated, yet controversial, sure, but the foreword by Christopher S. Hyatt and Baron von Gunzlach doesn't pull any punches. They call him one of the greatest mystics of all time.
Wow. Greatest mystics and controversial in the same breath. That contradiction immediately brings up something the source highlights as, like, the perennial problem of mysticism, which was just central to Crowley's whole deal.
Which is?
The absolute necessity, but also the near impossibility of getting past the ego.
Right. And the book's clear the ego isn't inherently bad. It's, an evolutionary necessity. It's how we operate in the everyday world.
Our operating system, kind of.
Exactly. But it's also profoundly limiting if you're seeking mystical freedom or, expanded consciousness. It's the barrier.
And according to Regardie's account here, Crowley faced this problem head-on. The book calls it his heroic and foolhardy total commitment.
Total commitment. And that's where you see the sheer range of techniques he threw at this challenge, according to this source. I mean, he didn't just explore ceremonial magic. He pushed it way, way beyond its conventional limits.
And he wasn't narrow about it either. The book details how he became an expert in, maybe a dozen or more different kinds of Hindu and Buddhist yoga.
Yeah, remarkable breadth there. He also used his creative output writing tons of poetry he felt was inspired, quite literally, by figures like Dionysus. He saw it as a way to just let the unconscious pour out.
And he even invented these, psychological tricks, like having two distinct personalities keyed to specific jewels he wore.
Which is fascinating in itself. But what really stands out is the source's point about his drug experimentation. It claims he experimented with more drugs, more frequently, than pretty much anyone in the West before the big shifts of the neurological revolution of the 1960s.
Wow, that level of exploration for his time was just unprecedented.
Completely.
Now, okay, that kind of radical approach, understandably, it wasn't met with universal applause, right?
Not even close.
The book highlights some really strong criticisms of his work, especially his poetry. For instance, someone named Hyatt is quoted pretty harshly, calling it bad poetry, even meaningless prose.
Yeah, Hyatt felt Crowley lacked a genuine surrender to the poetic moment. He thought Crowley's, occult interests and personal obsessions actually got in the way of writing real poetry, made it unsuitable.
But this is where the complexity just jumps out at you. Even in how people saw his work, the source contrasts Hyatt's view really sharply with Charles R. Camel.
Right. Camel looked at Crowley's collected poems and basically declared they had absolutely no peer or counterpart in the literature of our time.
I mean, that's not a small difference of opinion.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And Regardie's book suggests Camel actually presented a more accurate picture of Crowley as a mystic, even if Camel himself sometimes, moralized about him a bit too much.
And the real insight here, I think, is that the book argues you need to combine these wildly different viewpoints like Hyatt's and Camel's to get anywhere near a, quote, more adequate conception of the complexity as well as creativity of this man of genius.
It's not an either thing.
Exactly. It's both and. It really forces you, the listener, to think about how you evaluate someone this multifaceted.
And the source gives us a specific idea of what poetry meant in this context for Crowley. It wasn't just pretty words. It had to create a definite magical excitement, exaltation in the person experiencing it.
Like falling in love at first sight is how it's described.
Precisely. It had to work above just emotion and reason. Receiving it was supposed to be like a ritual magical initiation, something profound that shouldn't be interrupted.
So it's not just art. It's framed as a tool, really. A tool for psychospiritual impact, a magical act in itself.
Yeah, that's the idea presented here.
Okay, so shifting from his methods to the man himself. The book touches on Israel Regardie's first meeting with Crowley, Paris, 1928. Regardie was invited to be his secretary and study with him, which the book says was the fulfillment of a long-cherished dream.
Yeah, imagine finally meeting this legendary figure you've admired from afar, and the first thing he says to you are those famous or infamous Thelemic words, "Do what thou wilt."
It must have felt like stepping into a completely different reality. Of course, we know Regardie didn't stick around forever. He eventually broke with Crowley.
Right.
And the book mentions a specific trigger. Crowley apparently used an anti-Semitic slur, Frank, which hit a raw nerve for Regardie at that time. It highlights Regardie's sensitivity to criticism, even coming from his hero.
And Regardie's account, it doesn't shy away from all the external controversies that were constantly swirling around Crowley, like that investigation by the Surete Generale in Paris, apparently sparked by a sinister coffee brewing gadget.
A coffee gadget. That then led the authorities to dig up all this negative press, which the book calls vicious journalism, the Horatio Bottomley cum William Randolph Hearst variety, yellow journalism, basically.
And it also reminded them that Mussolini had kicked Crowley out of Italy a few years earlier, though the book suggests that mostly purely political expediency, not necessarily based on anything concrete Crowley had done in Italy.
Still adds to the picture, though. And then there was the discovery that during his time in America, around 1917, Crowley had written stuff that appeared to be pro-German propaganda.
Yeah, the source says P.R. Stevenson's book goes into detail on that. So he wasn't just stirring things up in occult circles. He was on the radar of international police and governments. He was a marked man in many ways.
The book also tackles something personal for Regardie, the anxieties he had before meeting Crowley, stemming from those same trashy Hearst newspaper exposes, specifically about potential homosexual advances.
Right, and Regardie makes it very clear in the text that nothing of this kind ever occurred between them. He even mentions sharing the specific worry beforehand with a friend named York.
It's interesting how upfront the source is about Crowley's sexuality, though. It says his bisexuality is indisputable. Points to his book, The Bhagya Muattar, which was all about homosexuality, and various poems throughout his work that are called frank confessionals of sexual experiences with men and boys.
And this is balanced, the source notes, by his acknowledged heterosexuality, although it uses terms like infidelity and promiscuity to describe it.
Yeah.
But the book points out he didn't hide any of this. He apparently lived by that command from one of his own holy books. Veil not your vices in virtuous words. He was just open about it all, for better or worse.
So finally, on this point about understanding the man, the source brings up John Simon's view. Simons apparently thought Crowley was altogether pathological, a schizophrene.
Which is a pretty strong diagnosis.
Yeah, and while Regardie finds that specific label too slick, too easy, he doesn't completely dismiss the idea of issues. He notes the presence of some kind of pathology.
And this is a theme we'll probably keep coming back to. How do you square potential genuine spiritual experience with apparent psychological problems? The book really grapples with that.
Okay, moving forward in Crowley's journey, we absolutely have to talk about the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Regardie's book is emphatic on this. After Crowley was exposed to its Kabbalistic system, its grades, its magical practices, he was never the same.
Yeah, this was clearly foundational. This is where he encountered the core Western esoteric system that would shape so much of what he did and thought later on. The book mentions other famous members too, like William Butler Yeats.
Right, and it draws a really key contrast there. Yeats was largely able to sort of move beyond the order. He integrated bits, sure, but wasn't consumed by it in the same way.
Whereas Crowley, even after his big break with the leadership, seemed to remain deeply defined by its structure and its philosophy. The source mentions Virginia Moore tried to argue Yeats was still deeply involved, but Regardie's view is clear. Crowley was the one who couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, really leave it behind.
So what was the system like? The book outlines the GD's pretty dense curriculum, as presented in the source. Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, tarot, astrology, geomancy, scrying, alchemy, that really complex Enochian system, and even yoga.
It was a whole package, a comprehensive system for inner development
Yeah.
aimed at transformation.
And it all started with the initiation, the neophyte degree. This was where the candidate was symbolically brought to the light. It represented the core goal, illumination, mystical experience.
And this is where Crowley shed his given name and took on that famous magical motto, Per durabo I shall endure.
The book describes the symbolic roles in that ritual, too. The Hierophant, representing the higher spiritual self. The Hegemon as the aspiring consciousness, the part of you reaching up. And the Hyrius as the active conscious will guiding the whole process.
And the symbolism described is just so vivid. The lamp on the altar, this glow of ultraviolet light, the paradox of black brilliance, the three officers forming a triangle around the candidate, the white cord bound 3 times, the cross and triangle symbols.
It was all designed, the book says, to be a catalytic agent, something to spark inner change.
And after neophyte came the elemental grades: earth, air, water, fire. These were aimed at awakening and integrating unconscious archetypes, seen as crucial steps in the great work of spiritual realization.
And a really key point in that journey was the Adeptus Minor ceremony. The source says this focused on the redemption of the personality and realizing your own potential godhead.
Right, and it's framed here psychologically, too, as the solution to the anima problem, culminating in that powerful cry, "Arise, shine, for thy light is come."
But what's striking is the challenge embedded in that ritual. You gain admission not by honors and dignities, not by your worldly status,
But solely through humility and purity of spirit. That principle. Well, it stands in pretty stark contrast to some aspects of Crowley's later public persona, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to. Finally, the book mentions how, within this Golden Dawn context, Crowley learned about this idea of a secret assembly of saints or adepts.
Ah, yes, from that book by Karl von Eckartshausen, which A.E. Waite recommended.
Right. And this idea apparently sparked a powerful ambition in Crowley to be noticed by or even join this hidden brotherhood of illuminated beings.
And that idea, that goal, it seems to have become a real driving force for him, woven through a lot of his later questing and work, a pretty provocative ambition.
Now, Crowley's time in the order, it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
Far from it. The source notes his rapid advancement through the grades. Regardie actually views this as sort of routine progress, partly because Crowley had already read so much and came in with a lot of existing knowledge.
So not necessarily instant proof of being a great magician right off the bat.
Right, though Regardie does concede Crowley brought his own genius to it all. But this fast track did create friction with the more straight-laced adepti in the order.
They were apparently deeply disapproving of Crowley's lifestyle. The source describes it with a certain flair, wanting to drink, fornicate, have fun, and raise hell.
Doesn't sound very straight-laced.
No. And he already had a handsomely scandalous reputation. These other members genuinely feared he was a bad apple who would just damage the order's image, maybe worse.
And the book even recounts these really remarkable stories, anecdotes of alleged psychic phenomena happening around Crowley, often linked back to the influence of the order's leader at the time, MacGregor Mathers.
Like what?
Things like a cab suddenly catching fire for no reason, a horse bolting unexpectedly, a fire that just wouldn't burn properly, a symbolic rose cross-fading, and even, bizarrely, a rubber raincoat catching fire.
Wow. I mean, whether you believe in the literal magic or not, those sound like intense psychic tensions manifesting somehow, tied to the conflict.
Exactly. And the conflict with Mathers himself became legendary. Mathers had his own struggles, apparently got dismissed from his museum job, relied on funding from others, translated that key text, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage.
And growing dissatisfaction with Mathers' autocratic leadership was definitely a big factor in the order's internal problems.
But the source highlights different views on why things went so wrong between them and within the order. Some blamed Mathers' irresponsible magic, or maybe his thirst for publicity stunts.
While others, including Crowley and Camel apparently, pointed to the Abramelin translation itself. They believed translating and working with that particular magical text attracted forces of evil that caused all the problems.
It's fascinating how the explanation really depends on who you ask, whose perspective you're getting.
Yeah, and a really significant figure mentioned here is Alan Bennett. The source says he lived with Crowley for about 18 months and became a crucial teacher for him.
Bennett's credited with helping Crowley develop into a fairly well-experienced magus, even before he reached a high degree like the Bortle grade.
And Bennett's later move to Ceylon, for health reasons, that had another big impact, didn't it? His later explorations there, especially around drugs and consciousness, are presented as a really significant sequel to the time they spent together.
Absolutely. Okay, let's turn now to some of Crowley's most important works and experiences, as Regardie's book sheds light on them. Regardie calls Mather's translation of the sacred magic of Ibrimelin the Mage an important determinant in Crowley's whole life story.
And the central practice from that book, the famous Abramelin operation, that became a major focus for Crowley. The goal, as described, was achieving the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, KCHGO.
That mystical union. Now, the source notes there's been some debate about whether Crowley actually finished this incredibly demanding months-long operation. Simons, for example, barely mentions it.
Right, but Regardie, having actually studied Crowley's magical diary from that period, states it's very clear that Crowley persevered faithfully and devotedly with it.
He found, quote, several brief references to the ecstasy of samadhi, using that mystical language of the kiss and things like that.
So from this book's perspective, Crowley did reach some kind of mystical peak during this time, specifically noted on his journey back to England from China, connected to this Abramelin work.
Then there's that really alarming Calcutta incident. The book recounts it in some detail.
Yeah.
During a festival, Durga Puja, Crowley was in a bazaar, felt threatened, felt like he was being followed, got pinned against a wall. And in a moment of what the source calls almost without thinking, he fired his automatic pistol, killed 2 men.
And his immediate reaction after running away?
An attempt to magically make himself invisible using the Harpocrates god form. The book notes the newspaper account and the police reward offered afterwards. A really dramatic, deeply controversial event mixing street violence and practical magic.
Yeah, that's jarring. The source also digs into Crowley's philosophical struggles around this time. It mentions him complaining to a friend, Thornton, that his analysis of sense impressions led him to conclude there was no causal connection between events.
Right. Seeing the universe as just a discontinuous sequence of events.
Which the book links back to an old, absolute idealistic position in philosophy. But what's really interesting is the parallel the source draws with the philosopher David Hume.
Hume, yeah, who applied that same critical analysis not just to the outside world, but to the ego itself.
And Hume came to a similar conclusion, didn't he? That our inner psychological stuff, impressions, sensations, it's also just a disconnected stream. There's no inherent integrating ego holding it all together underneath.
Exactly. No fixed self. And the book uses one of Crowley's own poems, starting, "Blind horror catches at my breath," to illustrate the feeling, the terrifying experience of this realization, what gets called the abyss in mystical terms.
It's where those causal links, both outside and inside you, seem totally destroyed, leading to this dissolution of the mind, the ego, into what the poem calls a black, chaotic curse.
Sounds like hitting absolute bottom, a complete breakdown. But the source says he was rescued from this state through intense Agawades invocations, rituals aimed at contacting his higher self, his holy guardian angel, his genius. These apparently culminated in the mystical state of samadhi and him claiming the major grade of 83, Magister Templi, Master of the Temple.
A huge step in his system. And all of this seems to build towards what the source calls the most important single event of his entire lifetime.
Which has to be the Book of the Law.
Dictated in Cairo, 1904.
Right. Through his wife at the time, Rose, or Oarda, who acted as the seer, the channel. What's interesting is Crowley's initial reluctance. The book says he had a 5-year reluctance to fully accept or acknowledge this book before he finally completely identified with its message.
And the circumstances of how it was received? The book describes them as unusual. Rose's key role, obviously, but also the unorthodox nature of the ceremony used to invoke the god Horus beforehand.
Yeah, apparently doing it before a window open to the ear and without incense, deliberately breaking some of the standard technical rules of magic.
Okay, so what about the content of the Book of the Law? The source describes it with really striking language. It has figurative eloquence, okay, and prophetic utterance, maybe a style similar to the Hebrew prophets or the Quran.
But the message itself is seen as totally distinct. Quite peculiar, marked by what the book calls a fierce and haughty disdain of humanity, a savage and awe-inspiring justice, and a cold, cruel, and relentless kind of mind behind it.
Wow. The source even says there's no mercy, nor consolation, nor hope, save in the service of this dread messenger. That sounds intense.
It's a challenging text, to say the least. The book mentions that Kamel, who we talked about earlier, had an extremely negative reaction to one passage he found just enormous and atrocious blasphemy.
Which is contrasted again with Regardie's perspective. By the time he wrote this book, he seems more accustomed, maybe, more inured to that kind of language. He viewed those passages less as simple profanity and more as passionate statements of revolt against and rejection of the household gods of conventional religion and morality.
A different framing. Now, the core message, arguably, do what thou wilt, how does the source interpret that?
Well, importantly, it's interpreted here not as just license to do whatever you feel like in the moment. It's presented as a sublimely austere ethical precept.
Austere? How so?
The source explains it as meaning. Act according to your true inherent nature, your unique purpose, like stars following their destined courses or water naturally seeking its own level.
Ah, okay. And the book argues that humans are maybe the only beings in nature that seem to consistently fight against this fundamental natural way of being.
Yeah. And it connects this idea to basic biological functions, like how an infant supposedly knows instinctively what food it needs. These things regulate themselves naturally without needing imposed compulsive moralities.
The suggestion being that conventional morality can sometimes actually be the result of repressing natural urges, which can then lead to pathological drives or behaviors.
It's a provocative idea. The source also points out, though, that the book clearly echoes Crowley's own underlying moral, social, and religious attitudes and his deep-seated rebelliousness.
So it reflects him.
It suggests these rebellious tendencies might have roots in what's described rather clinically as anal hostility, potentially influencing his quarreling, his homosexuality, and a certain irrational spitefulness that comes up sometimes. That's the book's psychological lens, trying to understand where some of his controversial traits might stem from.
And finally, on the book's impact, the source mentions Crowley's pretty dramatic belief about World War I and World War II.
What was that?
He apparently believed both wars were direct consequences of the publication of the Book of the Law, that they were fulfilling its prophecies of a necessary baptism of blood before a new world order, his Aeon of Horus, could emerge.
Wow. That gives you a sense of the cosmic scale he believed his work operated on.
Definitely. Okay, so looking at Crowley's later life and his legacy, through Regardie's perspective in this book, the view gets quite critical in some aspects. The source suggests his finest creative work was actually done before 1914.
Really? And that his life after that date actually did incalculable harm to his public reputation.
That's the view presented here. This is despite him continuing his magical path, even conferring higher grades upon himself during this later period.
The book also mentions his financial struggles, significant struggles, despite inheriting what was apparently a considerable fortune.
Yeah, and it attributes this partly to his upbringing. Suggests he just wasn't taught responsibility with money and kind of expected luxury as his birthright, never really learned to manage it.
And the book keeps highlighting that complex, often paradoxical nature of Crowley right up to the end. Falling out spectacularly with longtime friends and allies.
Yet simultaneously associating with a whole range of people described as miscreants. And Regardie's motive for writing this book, in part, was clearly to offer a more balanced picture against purely negative attacks, like John Simon's biography, The Great Beast.
Right, trying to provide more nuance. Which brings us to a really significant point that Regardie grapples with throughout the source. This complex relationship between spiritual attainment or claims of it and psychological issues.
Yeah, this is crucial. Regardie, having known many mystics and occultists personally, observed something pretty consistent. Even those who showed signs of what he considered genuine illumination often also exhibited glaring psychoneurotic traits.
Glaring? Like what?
He gives examples he personally witnessed. Things like severe bacteriophobia, an obviously overinflated ego, just plain rudeness, alcoholism, problems with overeating.
So real human flaws despite the spiritual practice.
Exactly. He suggests this points to a lack of integration or wholeness in the personality, even if someone reached certain spiritual heights or had profound experiences.
That really challenges a common, maybe simplistic assumption that having a big mystical experience automatically fixes all your psychological problems or makes you a perfectly balanced person.
Right. According to this source, those issues often persist and need to be dealt with separately on their own plane through psychological work or other means. They don't just magically dissolve.
And the book contrasts this messy reality with the ideal of surrender to God. It describes that surrender not as a quick fix, but as an incredibly difficult, lifelong discipline requiring harrowing psychological disciplines.
A very different picture from what the source seems to view as more superficial, modern metaphysical approaches. Just think positive and everything's fine.
Yeah, a far cry from that. But through all this complexity and criticism, the source keeps coming back to Crowley's fundamental message: the core quest. The pursuit of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, or put another way, the discovery of the true will, finding and living your unique purpose.
And the book really emphasizes that for Crowley, achieving this wasn't about shortcuts. Self-discipline of the most far-reaching and adamant type was prerequisite. It demanded rigor, hard work.
Regardie ultimately characterizes Crowley as someone preaching an aristocracy of spirit, a kind of brotherhood of Illuminati. Someone who, despite temptations, actually resisted just surrounding himself with adoring but stupid disciples.
So he sees him fundamentally as an adventurer in the spiritual realm, but importantly, not a dishonest teacher in terms of his stated aims and the methods he taught.
Leaving us with this picture of a man of, undeniable genius, undeniable spiritual drive, but one who wrestled with profound internal contradictions and external challenges his entire life. A subject Regardie's book explores with, I think, remarkable depth and honesty.
It really does. It's not a simple portrait at all.
So that wraps up our deep dive into Aleister Crowley, guided primarily by Israel Regardie's The Eye in the Triangle.
We've journeyed from his early life, his crucial Golden Dawn training, through his pretty radical techniques, yoga, magic, poetry, drugs, looked at key works like the Abramelin Operation and the Book of the Law.
Examined the controversies that just constantly followed him, and explored the source's really nuanced perspective on how his spiritual goals and his psychological makeup interacted, or maybe failed to integrate sometimes.
We've pulled out those key insights for you. That relentless struggle with the ego, the intense discipline needed for his chosen path, despite his own personal flaws, the revolutionary nature of do what thou wilt, as this book interprets it, and that ongoing debate about how you even begin to understand such a complex, paradoxical figure.
Yeah, judging the life versus the ideals versus the inner experiences. It's tricky. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer, maybe more layered understanding of someone who's often just reduced to a caricature.
It certainly highlights the complexities involved when you try to get a real handle on a person like this, and the challenge of navigating different perspectives, even within a single insightful book like Regardie's.
It really does. Which brings us to a final thought for you to maybe chew on. If, as this source strongly suggests, it is possible for someone to reach moments of genuine mystical insight, real illumination, while simultaneously struggling with significant unintegrated psychological issues, what does that tell us about the nature of spiritual growth itself?
What does it say about the persistence of the human psyche, maybe the shadow side, and the sheer challenge of achieving true wholeness, not just for these extraordinary controversial figures like Crowley, but maybe for any of us on our own paths?
Thinking about everything we've discussed today drawn from this source, what stands out to you from this deep dive?